Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. I'm excited tonight about our guest because we share a number of things in common, one of which is he's a former Lutheran, and so we connect. So in that sense, we're very united in how we're connected, former Lutheran. On the other hand, he's an architect, and I designed my house. But from that standpoint, he's way up here, and I'm way down here. I grovel at his feet for the ability to have the great skills to design and build a home. And what his particular apologetic, if you will, is through his book, Rebuild My House, a guide to building or renovating a Catholic church. And I think we'll find out that it was actually through this reflection on what is it that is central to the idea of the design of our worship space, to use that modern phrase, a church, is what brought him home to the church. Our guest is Arthur Lohsen. Arthur, welcome.
A real pleasure, Marcus. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the program. I just want to sit here and look at your beautiful book because of the great pictures of architecture. But as you mentioned before the program, that it was in some sense the writing of this book that helped you bring it all together. And
It was a good excuse, a good reason to sort of put everything down on paper and solidify the process that I had gone through to become Catholic.
And I'm thinking that as a great majority of our audience right now who are listening, that we're caught up in this idea of what is a good church and where is it and how should it be designed and what has happened in the architecture that's all around us. Because, I mean, you go into any city and it's a cacophony of ideas on architectural design. Is there such thing as beauty? So all these are all good questions that we'll get to, but let me back away and invite you to take us on the journey.
Well, thank you, Marcus. As you mentioned, I was raised in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, and I really enjoyed being Lutheran. My parents, Art and Joanne, did a wonderful job of raising my sister and I in the church. We went to church most Sundays, as you know. Lutherans don't take it, quite as an obligation as the Catholics do. But we had a church. We would go to church on Sundays. We said grace before dinner. We said our prayers at bedtime, and I really enjoyed the liturgy of the Lutheran Church, as you mentioned before the interview. The Red Book, the hymnal that we had for years and years, had that wonderful tradition and wonderful liturgy to it.
That's right.
So I considered myself a liturgical Lutheran, and I'm not sure whether that's an actual category of anything, but I took great solace and meaning from the liturgy.
You think, when you look back, and I'm trying to remember myself, did you think of yourself as a liturgical Lutheran? Was that, as you look back, that was the gift that you had as a young man, that you had this experience as a liturgical Lutheran and you understood your Christianity from that aspect? I mean, my guess is it's kind of like sometimes you're in something and you take it for granted.
That's right. In a lot of ways, I didn't realize that was what I had until it was gone. And I confirmation classes I really enjoyed, and I kind of liked the fact that Martin Luther was a pretty hardcore Catholic monk, and he had tackled the corruption in the church and sorted it all out, and now the Lutherans had everything going for them, and we knew what was right and what was wrong. The other thing that I took from the Lutheran Church was the notion that I had a direct and personal relationship with God. And in a lot of ways, that was my responsibility. It was my relationship to maintain. I had control over it, which I thought was, in a lot of ways, very comforting. So I went off to college to study.
Let me pause you there again. I don't mean to interrupt, but did you have any view of the Catholic Church growing up?
Healthy skepticism. We had, kids in the neighborhood who were Catholic, and we'd go to the First Communions, and the Catholic Church was always a little too decorated, a little too rigid. It was okay for them, but not our cup of tea.
Glad to be a Lutheran.
So yeah, a little more liberated. But went off to college to study electrical engineering. I was going to be an electrical contractor and follow in my father's footsteps. Until I failed Calculus 2 for the second time. And one of my professors suggested that maybe it would be better if I just drew pictures of buildings instead of trying to engineer them. So listening to that advice, I transferred back to the University of Maryland and got into the architecture school and did my undergraduate degree there. And really one of the first, looking back now, at the time I was clueless, but one of the key inflection points in my life where I really think the Holy Spirit was moving me in the right direction was the summer after my undergraduate degree. In 1990, I had my dream summer job lined up. I was going to go down to Ocean City in Maryland and work on a charter boat, marlin fishing all summer. I was going to get paid to fish every day. It was just the greatest thing in the world. And I was really looking forward to that. And then I saw a little flyer posted in the architecture studio announcing a study abroad program in Rome. And to this day, it doesn't make any sense why I decided I had to go to Rome, but I did. So I signed up for the program and spent the summer studying in Rome, and it changed me. It was the first time I had ever been surrounded by that type of beauty, that type of history. It's the first time I'd lived and worked in a city. It was just a remarkable experience. And it took a number of years for that experience to really gestate and for me to understand what it meant and what I should take away from it. But I'll never forget being in St. Peter's for the first time and spending hours just wandering through this magnificent basilica as an architect from that perspective, looking at the vaults and the pilasters and the domes and how it all works together. But what I left with was the realization that as I was standing behind the baldacchino of the main altar, looking up at the rose window, there's at the center of it a little white dove descending. And it just amazed me that this entire basilica sort of focused on this little message. And of course, now that's the Holy Spirit descending upon the congregation. But at the time, something about that just struck me, that all of this architecture can have that simple and straightforward a meaning. So the other thing that changed my life about experiencing Rome was meeting my wife there, which sounds exotic and romantic, that I came home with an Italian wife. But in fact, she grew up in the next suburb over from me in Maryland. So, but she came from a good Catholic family, so I got to come home and meet her 10 brothers and sisters in the backyard of their picnic as the new guy that Sue's dating. So it's been a little awkward ever since, if I'm honest. But so we were married in a few years later, and decided to be married in the Lutheran Church. At the time, I was set that I was a Lutheran. I wanted to stay a Lutheran, and Sue actually found some things in the Lutheran Church that she hadn't been experiencing in the Catholic Church. So she became a Lutheran, and that was a pretty simple process. They said, "Okay, you want to be a Lutheran? You're a Lutheran," and we were married in 1993, and started going to a series of Lutheran churches. And we would go to a church. It seemed like we'd go to a Lutheran church for 2 years, and then one Sunday they pull down the projection screen and get out the PowerPoint and say, "Okay, now we're going to try this." And there's a distinct line between worship and theater. Yeah. And the Lutheran Church, as we were experiencing it, had lost it. For us, it was no longer worship. It was a spectator event.
You know, I was thinking, I was going to ask you, and you mentioned when you were married in '93, and I was thinking the Catholic Church that your wife had been brought up in, and the Lutheran Church that you had been brought up in were both going through decades of change, right?
Yes.
And it's interesting you say almost matter-of-factly that there's a fine line between worship and theater. Well, during those periods, that fine line had become extremely blurred as we see it today, even as a priest recites the words of the Mass. Is this worship or theater? You know, can be a fuzzy line there. So I see that in your marriage coming together and what you guys were trying to find during this time.
That very true.
The fuzziness.
And for us, we were looking for the liturgy. I was looking for the liturgy, the tradition, the rigor of knowing why we're here, knowing what we're celebrating, what we're doing. And each Lutheran church we would go to would sort of change that around a little bit.
Yeah.
So each time we would leave one Lutheran church and look for the next one, Sue would say, well, why don't we try going to Mass? And sometimes we would. And I would approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism that, what's the priest? We don't really need a priest, and the saints and all these statues and the kneeling. It wasn't. I still wasn't ready to embrace it. Really, to sort of acknowledge that there was something much larger than myself that I was willing to humble myself and be a part of. So during that time, we had our two daughters, Viola and Elena, and I helped to start our architectural firm. And we were blessed early on with some projects for the Catholic Church. And getting to know some priests and nuns and a few bishops, and realize that they're regular people and seem to have a head on their shoulders and know what they were talking about. It sort of made Catholicism a little bit more approachable. And still wasn't ready to convert, but I was enjoying getting to know some Catholics. And also about that time, our younger daughter, Elena, was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. It's a genetic disease, and they told us that if she was lucky, she might live to finish high school, but she would spend a lot of time in hospitals between now and then. And that's the kind of thing that when you're hit with news like that, you either have faith or you don't. And it's interesting that Sue and I both immediately realized, independently, came to the same conclusion that we have no idea how we're going to deal with this. But we trust that God is going to give us the ability to when we need it. And that was a very comforting thing, still a great challenge, but we began that process with Elena. So about this time, another miracle showed up on our doorstep. One Tuesday afternoon, a lovely lady named Susan Watkins walked into our office and asked if we needed an office manager. And at the time, I didn't think we did, but there was something about the way she presented herself that made us think we should try to figure this out. So we offered her a job, and she's been with us ever since. A remarkable woman. She spent 7 years with the Sisters of Life in New York City. She's an amazing seamstress that sews the most beautiful vestments and paraments that you'd ever see. And she's also a fantastic office manager. So she became part of our firm, and she was the resource that I would go to ask questions about, well, Susan, why does the tabernacle have to be on center? And why is everybody so anxious about whether or not there's a communion rail? And what's with all the kneeling? And we'd have these wonderful discussions about Catholicism, and they would always end with her comment that you should really sit down and talk to my brother. Her brother is Monsignor James Watkins, a priest and pastor in Washington, D.C. So eventually I screwed up the courage to call Monsignor Watkins, and he said, Art, come out, let's sit in the garden and we'll have a chat. So he was the pastor of this beautiful historic church in downtown Washington, and he had this lovely garden in between the church and his rectory. So on Friday afternoons, I would go and meet with Monsignor. We'd have some iced tea, we'd sit in the garden, and we'd talk about Thomas Aquinas, the documents of the Second Vatican Council, metaphysics. It was wonderful. And then I'd go home for dinner on Friday night, and Sue would ask, okay, are you Catholic now? Can we go to communion? Or and I didn't know what the process was. I didn't know whether I was going to graduate, whether there was going to be a test.
Did you realize while you were having those that was the trajectory?
Yes.
So that was why. It wasn't just to find out, so I make sure you do the churches right.
Correct.
It had gotten to the point where you were...
I was asking Monsignor, how do I become Catholic? So I didn't have the heart to try to pin him down on, okay, what's the process and how to, because I didn't want to lose the spontaneity of those discussions. It was a really remarkable experience. So after a while, Sue got a little fed up with that and signed me up for the RCIA class at our parish. So she said, on Tuesday nights, you're going to go to RCIA, and Friday you can go fool around with Monsignor if that's what you... So it was a wonderful experience because I got sort of beginner and advanced Catholicism all at the same time. So I really got to experience the foundations of the faith and to ask the questions about transubstantiation and Mary and the saints and to sort of pull at the threads with Monsignor and have him explain the depth of meaning behind it all and to understand how it all works together, and just a remarkable experience of learning and understanding. And then I'd also get to know that when you're supposed to do the sign of the cross and when you're supposed to kneel, when you're supposed to stand, the pragmatic stuff that I never got because I wasn't raised Catholic.
Right.
So at the Easter Vigil in 2010, I entered the church with Susan Watkins as my sponsor. And 10 days later, the whole family was on a plane to Lourdes with the Order of Malta. We brought Elena there as a malade for her cystic fibrosis. And we had never done anything like this. You know, I was the newly minted Catholic, never been to France, never been on a pilgrimage. So that was how I found myself the next morning, jet-lagged, cold, standing outside in a wet rain, online to go to the baths at Lourdes.
Wow.
The women go on one side, the men go to the other. So I'm standing there completely alone. I don't know a soul. I don't speak a word of French. I'm asking myself, how did I get here? I'm waiting online to get to the front, to strip naked and hop in freezing water. And I have to admit, I had a series of questions about, is this really what I signed on for? And I just assumed at the head of the line it would be like Disney World, where there'd be a way I could sort of sneak out the side and I'd meet Sue and the girls at the river and, you know, they were too busy to take me and it's fine. And there wasn't. I get up to the front of the line and everybody's taking their clothes off and waiting online to hop in the... So I figured, well, I guess I'm Catholic. So the order had told us miracles happen at Lourdes, but they're not usually the big dramatic miracles that you're looking for. And the miracle for me at Lourdes was standing knee deep in freezing water, and the attendant asked me, he said, English? And I said, no, I'm American. And he rolled his eyes slightly and said, you speak English? I said, oh yes, I speak English. And he said, let's say the Hail Mary. And I realized, I don't think I know the Hail Mary. This is going to be awkward. And he crosses himself. We start reciting the Hail Mary. I knew all the words to the Hail Mary. And just as I'm amazed at, well, where did that come from? How did that happen? They dunked me backwards into the freezing water. So for me, that was the small, insignificant miracle that I took away from Lourdes, that maybe God was looking after me, and I knew more than I thought I knew. But Elena came away from Lourdes with the miracle as well. She hasn't seen the inside of a hospital. She hasn't spent the night in a hospital ever since. And that's the result of Sue's caregiving, a lot of fundraising, a lot of medical research and new therapies and drugs. But it's also the result of our faith and a lot of prayers. And that part of our family experience has really been wonderful.
Well, that's amazing. I love that description of knee deep in the water. The Lord Jesus, how did I get here? I could imagine your whole life coming together in that moment and wondering that, because that's a fast thing to happen. I want to back off a little bit to pause there, and we've got a little bit of time before the break. I wanted to start because I want to now connect how your architectural experience also led to that moment, which I know is a big part of your journey. What I was thinking, and I hadn't thought about this before until you're talking. My two oldest sons both majored in philosophy. And it's one thing to say to major in philosophy, but when you study philosophy, there are lots of philosophies. Who's teaching it, where they're coming from. And it hadn't crossed my mind. That's probably true of architectural school too.
Absolutely.
So when you're not just studying one way of doing it, there's a whole bunch of ways that you were being trained from the time all the way to your time in Rome. In fact, I was even thinking as I glanced through this that historically arches went from this to that, and that little move is very significant, right? From a rounded arch to a pointed arch. There's a big theology and history behind that, I'm assuming. Talk about that part of your journey and how this also led to you being knee-deep in water at Lourdes.
That's a great question, Marcus. And when I went to architecture school, I had no aesthetic pretensions. It was a career. I was going to do office buildings or hospitals or airports or whatever. I mean, it was just something that I could do and make a living. And architects are not taught classical architecture. You go to an architectural history class and you see pictures of old buildings, but that's pictures of old buildings. Architects are taught to be, thinking forward, creating new, different things, and there's been an abandonment of tradition, right? We have this wonderful architectural tradition, particularly in the Catholic Church. But that's seen from a historical perspective, not as a tradition upon which to build. So I was never exposed to traditional architecture as a living thing until I experienced it in Rome. And that took a few years to sort of process, and when I returned to Washington, I went back into graduate school in architecture, and I did all of my coursework, my design studios, and got to the point where I was ready to do my thesis. And this was a project I was going to spend the next year working on. And it was the first time anyone had ever asked what I wanted to design. Up until that point, they just said, you're going to design this, you're going to design this, these are the studio projects. And they said, Art, what do you want to do for your thesis project? And I didn't know. And I decided that I really should know why I was going to be an architect. So I told my professors that I was going to take some time off and work. And they said, that's a great idea, Art, but we're having this recession. No one's hiring architects. This is a really good time to be in school, so you should probably just pick a building and just do it. And by the time you graduate, people will be hiring architects and you'll get a job. And that was great advice, and I didn't take it. So I went and worked for, it ended up being 5 years, different architectural firms. And I discerned the fact that I wanted to learn traditional architecture. And I went back to the University of Maryland, and that was the focus of my thesis. And my professor said, well, you can do that, but we really don't know how to guide you, so you're going to have to kind of figure it out on your own. And I said, sure, that's fine.
That's an interesting statement itself.
They
don't know how to guide you in traditional architecture.
Well, especially now as a parent paying college tuitions for my daughters, I probably should have asked for a discount. But it was very much something that I was driven, I had a desire to learn and to do. And that has led to my understanding of classical architecture, traditional architecture. Now, at Frank and Lohsen, we call it timeless architecture. And that just works very well with the Catholic Church. Beauty is an essential component in Catholic liturgy. And it took me a long time to sort of figure this out, but truth, goodness, and beauty are three transcendentals. So aspects of being that we can experience here on earth, but are only perfected in heaven. So absolute beauty is a way of perceiving, understanding, seeing God. So yes, you can worship in an ugly church, but worship is so much more fulfilling in a beautiful church. And beauty is therefore not just a nicety, it's a necessity. And there are all sorts of challenges with achieving it, but it's important.
That's a great place to pause. We'll take our break because I want to come back and expand on that, because I'm guessing a lot of us in the audience have believed since the time we were in diapers that beauty is just in the eyes of the beholder. Let's address that doctrine and how it's affected the architecture in our country. Be back in just a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Arthur Lohsen, author of Rebuild My House, a guide to building and renovating a Catholic church. And it's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. And I think it touches on what we're talking now about. This idea of beauty. You mentioned those three transcendent ideas that are the foundation stones for lots of things, not just a building, but also what's on a piece of paper, the artwork and all that. But if you question those three, then the trajectory of that leads to aberrations, if you will.
It does. The fallacy in the statement that beauty is in the eye of the beholder assumes that the eye of the beholder is fully formed. The real way of interpreting that statement is that the flaw is in the formation of the eye. If you can't perceive the beauty that's around you, it doesn't mean that the beauty's not there or that it's not important. It means you need better formation to appreciate it. And that's something that our modern society has consciously walked away from. When I was in architecture school, beauty was not a metric. It wasn't something that you were evaluating. Is that a beautiful project or not? That's subjective. We can't judge something on its beauty, when in fact that's the most important part of any artistic endeavor. So we've, as a society, as a profession of architects, we've done a lousy job at creating beauty and maintaining beauty. And we're paying the price for it.
I think over the 19th century, particularly, pragmatism became the driving philosophy behind so much in America, and I'm guessing that affected architecture.
And thank God for the Catholics, it's affected us, but not as much. In the Protestant church, it was very much an exercise in pragmatic. You can worship in a barn. What happens there is just worship. It's not a sacred thing. In the Catholic Church, as soon as you acknowledge that is the Eucharist, that is the real presence of Christ, you have to ask yourself, what's the appropriate setting for that to reside? Is it in a barn, or is it in the most beautiful building you can possibly create? And it's something that's not an intellectual pursuit. It's that understanding of beauty is fundamental to our human nature. One of the things that Sue and I were concerned when I converted was our daughters, who were 7 and 10 at the time. We were kind of throwing them a curveball that we used to do this and now we're going to do that. And we walked into the back of our parish church, and I was trying to explain to them how things were going to be a little different and why this church was different than the last church. And I asked them, well, where's Jesus? And Viola, our older daughter, just pointed right at the tabernacle. She didn't point at the gigantic bloody crucifix. She pointed at the tabernacle. And I realized all at once that it's not complicated. They understand it. You need to have the faith of the child and see things through the eyes of the child sometimes, so that things are not as complicated as they seem.
I think it's fascinating to reflect on the idea that one of the key ideas that separates Catholics, and I would put into that Eastern Orthodox, and maybe some high Protestant churches, but generally not, and the rest of Christianity, is this understanding of a sacramental economy, is the way that God intended, the primary way that we are saved, that we receive grace, that through the physicality of the church and the sacraments, as opposed to most today, a growing higher percentage of Christianity doesn't accept that. It's me and Jesus. So I could imagine somebody answering that question, where is Jesus? Well, he's here.
Right.
Well, if that's your theology, then how's that going to affect architecture? And
Why
how
do you
going
need
to
a church at all? Yeah, exactly.
The golf course, that's really it. Or just a big building that I can use on Sunday for this, and on Monday nights it's basketball. But the sacramental economy, it isn't just, well, okay, let's throw some of these other ritualistic things in. No, this is a definition of it all.
Right. And there's a strong transcendental theological argument as to why a Catholic church needs to be beautiful. But let's set that aside and talk about the pragmatic reason why a Catholic church needs to be beautiful. For a parish, the church is the most expensive asset you will ever have. Forget salaries and insurance and paying the utility bills. A church costs millions of dollars, right? And what it says about you and what you believe and what your parish is what you're going to be understood. That's saying that's the billboard that's telling people who you are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
And for a long time.
forever. I mean, the Catholic Church isn't going anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So if you build a church that is underwhelming, it's banal, it's functional, it's ugly, you're missing a huge opportunity to provide that testimony of who we are as Catholics, what we believe, why we believe it. Yeah. And the other frustrating thing is you're going to have to tear that building down in 20 years because it's poorly built, the roof leaks, the mechanical system doesn't work anymore, and it's dated.
Yeah.
Architects love to talk about we need to build buildings of our time. And the problem with that is, just like fashion, times change. A building that we build in 1990 is going to look like it was built in 1990. And it's going to be out of date, and it's just not going to work anymore. So we've made a decent living renovating and replacing old churches that just don't work because they're old. They just don't look like Catholic churches. So building a church that's timeless, that's going to look like a church today, going to look like a church 20 years from now, going to look like a church 100 years from now, is the best stewardship investment that you can possibly make as a parish. And yes, it's going to cost a little bit more, it's going to take a little bit longer, but over that 100 years, it's going to be so much more of a value to the parish. So that's the practical argument that we make to a pastor who has an ugly church or needs to build a new church and is struggling with, how do I think about how to do this? How can I build a beautiful church?
Yeah, I have no architectural background, and I don't play one on TV either, but I remember one of my Protestant churches I serve, and I don't know what the time period was, but it's just a big old A-frame. Mm-hmm. There it is, a big old A-frame. I suppose it's very pragmatic, it's very easy, right? It's very self-supporting on the inside of the building. But, you know, it's not a very traditional, the message of it. And then there it is, here we are 50 years since it was built. You know, what is the message that it carries? And so, in fact, I mentioned earlier in that program, and I wanted you to talk about that because I don't know if you, when you were studying architecture and they weren't dealing with traditional, whether you even talked about that historic move from round arches to pointed arches, because that in itself just kind of carries a big message.
It does, and the wonderful thing about classical and traditional architecture is it's not all the same thing. There's this wonderful spectrum of design influences from Greek to Rome to the Gothic to the Baroque and the Rococo and neoclassical. And each one of those styles has different embellishments, different details. The arches are round or pointed or segmental, which is sort of a squashed arch. And the importance is less in the aesthetic of those individual details as it is in the order, the symmetry, the color, the sort of basic fundamental aspects of the classical space. And those are things that carry over between a Gothic cathedral and a Tuscan chapel. They share those same characteristics of proportion and beauty.
All right. Now, you'd also said that the pragmatic side of the church. Now, you'd also said there was another side to make sure there's more of the theological, the conveyance, the message.
There is. And I also warned you that I'm not a theologian or a terribly good Catholic apologist. I draw pictures of pretty churches for a living. But the theological argument, it has to do with the fact that we can perceive beauty, right? We're inspired by a beautiful church in ways that we're not inspired by in an ugly church. It's why when you walk into a beautiful church, you stop and pause and take it in, and you're not checking your cell phone, you're not chatting with your neighbors, you're in the moment. In an ugly church, you don't have that that clue, you could be anywhere. And that beauty is, as a transcendental, it's a way of experiencing the presence of God. And beyond that, we start getting into theology and philosophy, and I'd have to use one of my phone of friends to answer that question fully.
All right. I know I've mentioned on the program many times my love for a book by St. Bonaventure, which is Journey of the Mind to God. And in that book, he talks about, this is very simplified, but that the way of the journey to intimacy with God is you begin by opening your eyes to the world he's made around us, rather than just seeing it as a blur, to pause and look closely for the vestiges of God. And then when you see that, it should draw you to gratitude. Mm-hmm. And my guessing is that you can take that same idea and say that's what a church should do.
Absolutely. A church is the foretaste of heaven. It's your opportunity to experience and be in communion with Christ every Sunday morning, every day. And the thing that an ugly church does that a beautiful church doesn't is, in the ugly church, you're not inspired to go home and tell people what a wonderful experience you had, right? At the end of the Mass, when they say, Mass is ended, go forth and, show people your, I'm paraphrasing here, but how many people actually walk out the door, shake the pastor's hand, and go home and tell, you're not going to believe what I just experienced, right? You were in a room with Christ. You were as intimate and personal and connected as you're ever going to be in this life with your Creator. Shouldn't you take that with you when you go? Or is it just a regular run-of-the-mill experience? So a beautiful church is the right setting and reinforces the fact that what's happening here is not just special, but transcendent. It's sacred.
One other thing that crosses my mind in terms of how architecture has changed is that many of these older churches, part of the design, I'm assuming, was since they were places of worship and proclamation, that they were designed to bring the best effect out of the human voice.
Absolutely.
And so, but our technology has changed everything.
Acoustics is a huge part of a church, not just the spoken word, which is absolutely vital, but the music. And the wonderful thing about Catholicism that is very different from my Lutheran days is Catholicism engages all of the senses in the Mass. So you're in a beautiful surrounding. There should be a hierarchy to the lighting. Most Catholic churches in Rome are dimly lit. You have to sort of stop and let your eyes adjust. You hear this wonderful music. You smell the incense. You're engaged on all these different levels. And all of those are absolutely vital to a beautiful Mass. So architecture used to be called the mother of the arts. It was the vessel upon which all of these liturgies could be built. And in every church we do, we worry about the acoustics. We work with engineers to get the organ right, to get and even though you have a sound system, you have to tune it so that it works properly. It's a big part of making the church beautiful.
Yeah, and sometimes in these older buildings, when you try and put the sound system in, it's hard to hear what he's saying. He's right there, but I can't quite hear it because there's bouncing around that wasn't intended in the first place.
And one of most older churches, stone churches, brick churches, are very reverberant. They're very active acoustic spaces. And if you speak in a normal voice, particularly if you're speaking through a microphone, it's unintelligible. the sound is garbled by the time you get 3 pews back. And in my parish, I lecture, so this is something I'm very familiar with. But if you train yourself to speak in a space like that, so the lectors at the cathedrals, they're taught how to speak in that space so that they can be understood, and it's just a different way of presenting the word.
Got an email, Shannon from West Virginia. While lots of people say that apologetic books or learning Catholic beliefs help draw them initially towards the Catholic Church, what case do you think could be made for the impact of beauty within Catholic churches to help prepare someone to be intrigued by the truth of Catholicism? Is it an angle worth pursuing, especially for people who aren't overly open to things Catholic?
Absolutely. I remember as a child going to the Catholic Church in our town, and it was always columns and statues of saints. It was always, I interpreted it as Italian. It was always a little bit strange and foreign. And in a lot of ways that can be a good thing. You want people to understand that this is a different setting. It's not your living room. It's not the shopping mall. It's not your school. It's a sacred precinct. It's something special. And if it's not a beautiful place, you lose that opportunity. So I think beauty has brought me to the Catholic Church. Yeah. And I think it has a lot of power to bring a wide range of people to the church.
As parents, how do we teach children to catch the idea that beauty is not merely just in the eyes of the beholder? How do we, get them to see that there's something really transcendent here?
That's a great question. Now I'm starting to second guess myself and ask if we've really done that well with our daughters. It's something that you don't get from pop culture and society. It's something you have to show people. And I think travel is an important way to do that. We've been fortunate to be able to take our girls to places like Rome and show them these places firsthand. And there's no substitute for that. But even around town, taking them to the shrine in DC, taking them to beautiful churches and giving them those opportunities, it shows them that there are things that are sort of more worth and deeper meaning than they might otherwise experience.
And if beauty, as the emailer questioned it, is a form of proclamation of the gospel, then you could also recognize that the enemy would want to attack that. And so we live in a time when there's this complete confusion about what's beautiful and what makes it, and the devil laughs because he's taken away the foundation for this. So we have to which explains to me why an architectural class in a secular university doesn't want to deal with traditional.
The devil doesn't have to work very hard on the people who have already turned their back on the church. His biggest threat are the people who come every Sunday. But if he can cast a veil over the beauty of the church and send people away without a genuine experience between them and their Creator, now he's done something. And if we can remove that veil and pull it back and show people the real beauty of why they're there, people will take that home with them, and they'll tell their neighbors. They'll be back on Sunday. They'll raise their children to appreciate that.
And sometimes at first people won't be able to put a finger on what. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but there's something here. Yeah. There's someone here. And it's kind of like your daughter saying, well, he's there. That's what we want them to be able to say. Another email, Carla from Middletown, Delaware, has Arthur Arthur noticed any similarities between his experience of worship as a Lutheran and that as a Catholic in the Mass. I've never been to a Lutheran service, but believe that there are some common aspects. If so, did these similarities help open his heart to the Catholic Church?
Very much so. In fact, the liturgy that I grew up using as a Lutheran, a lot of the prayers are almost exactly the same. The Eucharistic prayer, so it was a very familiar transition from the Lutheran liturgy to the Catholic liturgy. Where I got lost in the middle was when the Lutheran liturgy stopped being the Lutheran liturgy that I was used to and went off on different tangents. So in a lot of ways, I was looking for the rigor and the tradition that I had originally had in the Lutheran Church, and I found that in the Catholic Mass.
I'm curious what project you're currently working on. Anything special?
We've been blessed with a lot of wonderful projects. My partner Michael Frank and I and our talented staff have been worked on projects from Rome to Australia and everything in between. So currently we're working on a very large shrine for Blessed Stanley Rother in Oklahoma City. That's an amazing project.
Wow.
We're working on a project in South Carolina for a new church just north of Charleston. That's an amazing project as well. And all number of smaller projects and renovations and everything in between.
I'm going to ask a question that in some people's mind might be a bit controversial, but I'd love your thoughts on this. When I just came back from our pilgrimage in Rome, one thing I noticed is that many of the very most traditional ancient churches there seem to have been designed with ad orientem in mind in terms of the way the priest faces. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on that in terms of traditional design of the sanctuary and where our Lord is positioned in the church?
Ad orientem Mass is a wonderful thing. I've been to the Latin Mass, and the wonderful thing for me about the Catholic Church is the range of expression. So, going to Mass in France and in Australia and in Italy, it's the same Mass, which I take great comfort in. For me, the Latin Mass is a little bit abstract. I still enjoy it, but I certainly don't think the church has to be one way or the other.
Right. Yeah. And in my mind, I was making the separation between Latin or vernacular and the focus
right.
in the architecture, and I've sometimes wondered prayerfully whether in the last 50 years when we moved everything around, whether we were moving things around in a way that wasn't the way that the place was originally designed for places to
Especially when you take the tabernacle and you move it down the hall. So churches are designed with that hierarchy in mind. The tabernacle is best right on center behind the altar where it was originally intended.
That's right. Wow. How does one go about taking a sanctuary? When do you decide it's time to tear this one down and rebuild a new one, or when it's time to try and reshape?
That's a great question. We've done both. The real question is, how do we afford to do it, right? We want a beautiful church, but we don't have any money. And the answer is that you can start small. Buy your pastor some beautiful vestments. Use incense. Ring the bells at the consecration. Play organ music, even if it's only on a Casio keyboard. Start small and show people some of the depth and the meaning and the beauty in the Mass. And then you can worry about whether we should redo the sanctuary or whether we should tear it down and build a new church.
All right. Art, thank you very much.
Real pleasure, Marcus.
Thanks
for
very
having me.
much. And I look forward looking closer at your book, Rebuild My Church. And it's a beautiful book, and I recommend all of you, especially if you're wondering about your church and whether it's time to move on, this maybe give you some ideas. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. Again, as I do every week, I want to encourage you to check out our website, chnetwork.org, where you'll find other stories like Art's of people who are drawn for a variety of ways. God uses a lot of different tools to awaken us to the beauty of our Lord Jesus and his church. And we love to talk with you about that. If there's some way we can help encourage you on your journey of faith. God bless you. See you again next week.